What's on YouTube? Welcome back everyone, this is Lee, and today we'll be talking about the YongNuo 56mm 1.4 lens versus the Viltrox 56mm 1.7 lens. So with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started, there are three things I want my audience to know. Number one, YongNuo, they did send this lens over to me for evaluation. And also, Viltrox, they also sent me this lens for evaluation. So all opinions are my own opinions about both lenses. And also, I did the review with the Viltrox 56mm 1.7 versus the Sigma 56mm 1.4. I'll leave a link down below for that test, since that's kind of connected to this test right here, because we're using the same 56mm Viltrox versus this brand new YongNuo 56mm lens. So with all that out the way, let's take a look at some specs. So the YongNuo versus the Viltrox, let's first off talk about price. Now the YongNuo comes in at $268, whereas the Viltrox comes in at $139, which means that throughout this entire video, you guys need to decide if the YongNuo is worth that extra $129. Now the YongNuo is offering 1.4 aperture, whereas the Viltrox is offering 1.7. They are both 85mm full frame equivalents. They both have 9 blades. The YongNuo is offering 58mm filter size, whereas the Viltrox is offering 52mm filter size. But the YongNuo comes in with only 10 lens elements, whereas the Viltrox comes in at 11 lens elements. So that'd be very interesting when we get into the testing. Also, if you take a look at the size, YongNuo is 375 grams. And the Viltrox is 187 grams. Now, let's take a look at some features. Now, the YongNuo is offering a longer lens hood over the Viltrox. So if you're shooting in a bright scenario, definitely the YongNuo probably is the way to go if you want to avoid some of the flaring. Also, if you take a look at the rubber gasket, the rubber ring around the YongNuo, definitely YongNuo is offering more weather resistance on the lens over the Viltrox. And also the USB-C, it's on the side of the YongNuo, whereas the Viltrox is on the back rear of the lens. And if you take a look at this test right here, where I dump slight water on the lens, you can clearly see that the YongNuo, the water just comes right off, whereas the Viltrox, the water still stays on the lens, and that's due to the coating that's on the YongNuo. Also, YongNuo is offering more features on the lens with autofocus buttons, AEL buttons, autofocus manual switches, aperture ring, and a focus ring, and a full metal build, whereas the Viltrox is only offering a focus ring with a plastic build. Now with all the specs and features out the way, let's take a look at some testing. Now as for the first test, this is the bokeh ball test, and as usual, bokeh balls are very subjective, so I'm going to let you guys decide on whether which bokeh balls works for you guys. But just keep in mind that both lenses are 9 blades, and the YongNuo looks very geometric in its bokeh, and the Viltrox bokeh seems to be slightly bigger than the YongNuo, even though the Viltrox do suffer from focus breathing. So keep that in mind. We'll see that later on in the test. Now as for this next test, this is the bokeh blur test. I'm also going to let you guys decide on whether which bokeh blur works for you. But I do want to point out that the Viltrox is slightly further away due to its focus breathing. And of course, the YongNuo do come at a 1.4, which gives it slightly smoother bokeh over the 1.7. Now as for the distortion test, the YongNuo do have slight distortion in its lens over the Viltrox. Now here is the chromatic aberration test. There's 2 sets. This set right here, this is where I'm shooting at a aluminum roof on a sunny day. And as you can see, the YongNuo do have chromatic aberration in its lens up to f4. Now here is another chromatic aberration test. And already, as you can see, the YongNuo do suffer from chromatic aberration up to f4. Now as for this test, this is the vignetting test, and I will say that the Viltrox do have more vignetting than the YongNuo. Now as for the next test, this is the flare test, and I'm shooting directly at a 200 watt COB light. I do notice that the Viltrox do suffer from flaring. Also, the YongNuo, the way it's dispersing the light in its glass, you can clearly see that you do get some starburst and a brighter image over the Viltrox. Now here is the landscape test. Let's take a look at the scene. This is 1.4 versus 1.7. And already, as you can see, the 1.7 on the Viltrox background is sharper than the YongNuo. YongNuo is softer on the edges, it seems. Also, foreground seems to look identical. On the right side of the lens, the YongNuo seems to be soft. Background seems to be slightly softer than the Viltrox. 1.4 versus 1.7 landscape. Here is 1.8. Let's take a look again. It looks like the Viltrox is sharper in the background. And let's take a look to the left. Seems to be slightly softer on the YongNuo. Center of the image foreground looks more or less the same. On the right side of the YongNuo is quite soft. Midground on the YongNuo looks very sharp, but the background of the Viltrox looks sharp. Here is f2. Let's take a look at the center of the image, and the story remains the same. Viltrox is sharper in the background. Also, Viltrox is sharper on the edges, even though it's wider than the YongNuo due to its focus breathing issues. Let's take a look to the foreground, mid foreground, more or less the same. Side of the image, more or less the same. YongNuo is slightly softer, out of focus on the right side of the lens. Background, Viltrox is sharper, so there we go. Here is f2.8. And yeah, I would say it's more or less the same. I think Viltrox is slightly sharper in the background. It's just slight. Foreground, midground. Foreground looks more or less the same. Yeah, it's more or less the same at this point. Yeah, the right side of the YongNuo is quite out of focus, soft. The background looks pretty good on Viltrox. Here is f4, and I would say at this point, I think the background might be even in terms of sharpness. Left side seems to be more or less the same. Right side seems to be, oh, more or less the same it seems. Okay, there we go. And yeah, f4 it is. Looks like that's where things even up, f4. Here is 5.6, and I will say it's more or less the same in terms of sharpness. Left side seems to be quite even over there. Foreground seems to be just more or less the same. Maybe that bush right there on the Viltrox looks more focused than the YongNuo. On the right side, looks like Viltrox, Viltrox might be just a little bit sharper. That's a tiny bit
around
sharper.
F11,
leave your comments down below.
Everything looks more or less the same,
F8.
actually.
I would say it looks the same in terms of sharpness. All the vignetting on the Viltrox, you can remove that easily in post. But at this point, in terms of sharpness, yeah, it's about the same. I can't really nitpick right here. It's more or less the same. And here is f11. And the story remains the same. It's more or less the same in terms of sharpness. So there we have it.
Midground, background, the edges looks more or less the same. Foreground looks kind of identical. On the right side looks more or less the same.
And here is f16. It looks, yeah, about the same. Now here is the portrait test. Already right off the bat, you can definitely see the edges on the YongNuo. It does have slight chromatic aberration over the Viltrox. Viltrox looks very sharp on the edges. Also, even the center of the image, it looks very sharp on the Viltrox over the YongNuo. But this is 1.4 versus 1.7. Here is 1.8 versus 1.8, and the story remains the same. Chromatic aberration on the edges on the YongNuo, sharp on the Viltrox. Let's take a look at the shoulders. Looks, yeah, you can see the chromatic aberration on the YongNuo. Center image is sharp on the Viltrox, and there we go. F2, yeah, it's still the same, slight CA on the edges. By the way, this is very subjective. Some people may want this in their photo, so it depends what you guys are looking for. You're looking for something sharp, Viltrox looks like it's the way to go. And the YongNuo looks like it'll give you a little bit more character in your portraits, so just keep that in mind. Here is 2.8, and the story remains more or less the same. Edges looks like it's clearing up, it's getting sharper, but you can see slight CA on it, just very slight. And here is F4. I would say, yeah, I think Viltrox is still sharper on the edges in portrait. And here is 5.6. Seems like the edges did clear up. Looks more or less the same at this point at 5.6. I do want to point out that I kind of prefer the skin tone on the YongNuo over the Viltrox. It's very interesting. And I look very healthy, if I may say. But yeah, it looks a little bit warmer on the YongNuo. And here is F8, and the Viltrox seems to be slightly on the cooler side from what I'm seeing. Also, I want to point this out. I did nudge the camera 4 to 5 inches on the Viltrox to compensate for the focus breathing, so just want to point that out. Here is F11, and yeah, I kind of prefer the skin tone on the YongNuo over the Viltrox, but the Viltrox is a super sharp lens, so that's something that you guys need to decide. Do you get the nice skin tones with slight CA on the edges, or do you want to get sharper images and have a slightly cooler skin tone? And here is F16. And it's more or less the same in terms of sharpness. But yeah, skin tones on the YongNuo looks very nice actually. So just wrap things up, the Viltrox versus the YongNuo. Now let's talk about the pros for each lens. For the Viltrox, in summary, it is the most compact, affordable, sharpest aps-c lens on the market as of today that I have ever tested so far. That's including the Sigma as well. So that is pretty good for the Viltrox. I think a lot of people will gravitate towards the Viltrox due to its size and also sharpness. So good job for Viltrox. Now for YongNuo, something that they offer that the competition is not offering is a full metal build. That is pretty cool. And also the focus ring and the aperture ring is all metal as well. And it comes with switches with the manual focus and autofocus, and also buttons for autofocus and AEO. And it comes with a rubber ring at the end of the lens for weather resistant, and also a coating at the front of the lens for weather resistant from the rain. Now, YongNuo do offer a remote control for the lens, so if you're doing more cinema work, definitely YongNuo is offering that over the competition. And in my entire test, I did notice that my skin tone on the YongNuo looks pretty nice, so I have to give YongNuo that. My skin looks a lot better on the YongNuo versus the Viltrox, but if you guys are looking for more, I guess cinematic type of look, you're looking for more chromatic aberration in your image, definitely YongNuo will give you that in your image, of course, and also with the geometric bokeh, that is also something to note for it. And the longer lens hood, if you're shooting in a brighter environment, you definitely need that as well. And actually without it, it did better than the Viltrox, so that is pretty good to know that YongNuo, they do have something slightly different from the Viltrox. So with all that said, I want to thank Viltrox for sending out their lens, and also YongNuo for sending out their lens for testing. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully my video has helped you guys to navigate in this crazy saturated lens market where there's a there's a tons of lens out there. And I did like what, 356mm lens so far. So that's pretty crazy. But anyways, thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you guys next one, all right? Take it easy. Peace.